Welcome to my Commodore 64 Games memories. This is where I look at old games and some of the technical details behind them. Let's get into it. Today we have Hunchback by Ocean Software, published in 1983. I'm going to be using the tape version of this. It was developed by a person called John Steele. Actually, it turns out that many years later, when I started working for Argonaut Games in London, I ended up working with John Steele. I remember that he was a very nice guy. He used to organise things like the pool competition, and because he was very good at pool himself, he usually ended up winning those competitions. This was back in my early days at Argonaut Games, when I was very much younger than I am today. This is a conversion of the arcade game Hunchback, which is kind of like a platformer, kind of like a force platformer almost. You have to jump or navigate through different screens. Because this is the tape version, it's got the standard little flashy colour bars on the screen, which back in 1983 was a little bit almost like magic, to be honest, because I was only like 10 years old at the time. So I'm going to warp past these. Here we go, here's the title screen. Hopefully the joystick works. And now we have some music with the bouncing, jumping Quasimodo and some scrolling screens. Now, the screens that you see scrolling in here are not actually the screens that you get in those specific orders. In the bottom left hand corner we've got the overall map status, and then there is a little guard climbing up the wall to come along and attack me if I don't complete the level quick enough. So I've managed to jump over the fireball or whatever it was. This one you have to navigate a swinging rope. And of course I jump off too quickly and I die. I always liked, when I was younger, the little crinkly bottom part of the screen that comes along. I always thought it looked quite nice. Back in these days, of course, Commodore 64 games and their graphics were not that mature, I would say. I think the developer actually created the graphics as well for this. Let's just double check. So John Steele did the music, he developed it. I don't know if he did the graphics. The information I can find doesn't say. Anyway, so there are different screens and you have to navigate them. And in that one you have to avoid the spiky bits. This one you have to avoid the spiky bits, and also an errant fireball that comes along. Really annoying. And you know, you have to time it, so obviously you don't jump into the fireball and headbutt it, because that would be silly otherwise. I don't think the timing on these screens is actually consistent. I think it might subtly change each time that you're playing through it. And great, yeah, there's a dagger that just unfairly comes along and pokes you in the bum. And then of course I mistime the jump and it is game over. And that is a very quick, rubbish playthrough of Hunchback, because I'm not very good. The thing I like about this game as well is that if you press F1 you get the instructions. Thank you for that. It was always very useful to get the instructions if you did not have an original copy of the game. Anyway, so let's have a look at the technical details behind this game. It's actually a really small game. First of all, let's analyze the original tape file in my tape utility, and I can see here that it's got some kernel data, obviously, as a turbo auto-starting bootloader, and it will start the code at 3F2 via the char out vector at 326. We can see it's loading data at 31B. This is confirmed by the tape tool analysis software, and we can see that it's loading this chunk of data at 31B. That's how this tape is meant to auto start. We can see where 3F2 appears in the data that has been loaded. So what we can do is that we can look at this in the ICU Vice debugger. We'll put a breakpoint at 3F2 if I remember the correct command. BK is the short and abbreviated version of the command in later versions of Vice, and I tend to use those, which is why I'm always typing BK in a much earlier version of Vice. Anyway, so we'll just load the tape now. And here we can see we've come into some code at 3F2. Let's just validate the CPU execution history just to see how it got there. And if we have a look at the last 10 instructions, we can see quite clearly that FFD2 was jumping through the vector at 326, which is how it got to the code at 3F2. Because 326 has a low and a high address, because you can see it's using the indirected jump method there to use the vector at 326, 327 in hex. And this is where it goes into the code. We can see that it's loading 7 and storing it in 1. So it's making sure that the CPU is in the right banking mode, and then it just jumps to some code which was loaded earlier on. And we can see that it's doing some stuff with the NMI timer and just setting it up so that it returns back via an RTI at FEC1, which will just make sure 318 hardware NMI interrupt address handler, which is the vector routine there. FEC1 should be RTI, and yes it is. So it's a very quick and simple way of claiming the non-maskable interrupt and actually not making it or not letting it do anything. This was probably done so that the user could not set up a non-maskable interrupt and then interrupt the loading of the software, I expect. There's a whole bunch of extra stuff, and then we've got some JSRs to 351, which seem to load bytes from the tape. Looking at this structure of the code here, we're JSRing to 31B, storing A, C3, C4, AEF, AE and AF. Usual standard kind of stuff, really. We're going to 31B, we're then going back up again. We can see that we've loaded code at 31B already. Little bits of code here and there. If we have a look in the disassembly, we can just see it's doing CIA checks, incrementing the border, getting bits from tape, getting bytes from tape, storing the bytes into 0-page addresses, ready so that the data can then get stored into memory by that store A. This jump at the end just jumps back to the loading routine, which gets another byte. There's a little set with carry, SEC, ADC, add with carry, then store into 9E. The 9E looks like a very simple CRC check. If it succeeds, it will jump to the code at 400 in hex. If it doesn't, it will jump to the reset routine at FCE2 in hex, which is here. So very short and simple and sweet little auto booting tape loader with some turbo tape data there. So let's let that continue on. It looks like we've understood what most of the code is going to be doing there. Kind of like pretty much standard stuff, to be honest. Boom, there we go. Jumping to 400 as expected. If we have a look at the text screen data that was loaded, we can see here in the default screen at 400, it's loaded a bunch of extra code. There's no other loaded code anywhere else, at 800 in hex for example, in the bottom left hand quadrant of the debug view there. We can have a look at the disassembly of the code at 400, and it's just doing a bunch of stuff. It looks like it's restoring the vectors that were overwritten by the auto-booting tape turbo loader to then restore the vector values to what they should be. It's then copying a bunch of code and storing it into very lower zero page. So we're updating it looks like it's updating the tape turbo loader. It's patching a few what looks like the vectors at 300 in hex onwards. We can see here it's doing a load while before focus. Eventually it's going to A644, jumping back into the kernel basic. So we'll see what that does. It won't take too long because actually it's loading a very short amount of data. It loaded a very short basic program in the default area for where basic programs get loaded at 800 in hex. It displayed the message saying loading time approximately 2 minutes. It's then running the tape turbo load, which loads all of the data into memory, and then it runs the game. Start address is 16384, which is 4000 in hex. And there we go. So there isn't too much actually loaded into memory at this particular point in time. You can see that it's mostly default stuff. It's just loaded some data at what looked like 3C00 in hex. Onwards, it's got a score table stored up here. And then that's basically it. There's nothing much else. In here you can see all of the text screen data. So let's just double check all of the loaded data in memory with the sprites and the character sets and the text screens using the various different views. So we have the character set in the bottom right, the sprites in the bottom left, the text screens as they load in. We can see that there's a whole bunch of sprites. The rope is sprites. There's a love heart animation, which I don't actually remember seeing in the game. There's a whole bunch of animations for Quasimodo. The climbing knight, for example. We can see the character set up at the end of the second bank. In memory we can see the high score table being displayed. There's quite a nice little attract mode here actually, where you can see the game being played in inverted commas, probably a recording. Don't know for sure. I'd have to analyze the code just to be sure. Or maybe it's just running some coded logic to display all of this. So Quasimodo jumps across, and then shows the message featuring the bells jumping around. Yes. So we can see the layout of the character set and the graphics, and where the screen is in memory as it's being scrolled around. So there's this little basic program, which we can see here. So anyway, let's reset the computer. Let's do the old little restore basic program poke and sys. 42291. Do a list, and there we go. We can see the basic program that was running. First time round, it sets the screen, displays the message, waits for a little while with the 4NS loop, then does a load. The load is actually intercepted by the tape turbo loading routine, so it's actually set the soft vectors down in zero page, and then once it finishes, it restarts the basic program again, but C=2 this time, and then it uses sys16384 to start the game. Very, very simple. So it looks like maybe the programmer who developed this originally, Mr. John Steele, supplied the little basic loader, which then loaded some data, probably using the kernel loader, maybe, possibly, and then whoever was mastering this for Ocean decided that they would add a tape turbo loader instead, which basically loaded the basic program, claimed the vectors with a tape turbo loading code, and then loaded the second part of the game. That might be the way it was done when it was being mastered, because generally speaking, software publishers back in those days would prefer to use their tape turbo loading and tape mastering software, because they knew what was working with their tape duplicating companies. They had already tweaked the tape turbo loader to work well with whoever was duplicating the tapes for the company at that particular point in time. Different tape duplication companies had different capabilities for handling different speeds of tape turbo loader. This is why it was quite common to use consistent and well-working tape turbo loaders. So thank you very much for watching these crazy C64 Games Retros videos. If you like what you see, then please do consider liking or subscribing to this channel so that I know that you like what you see, and I hope to catch you again next time. Take care wherever you are.